The kitchen was a quiet haven in Daniel's modest home, its worn linoleum floor catching the first glimmers of dawn on a chilly March morning in 2025. At 6:45 a.m., the air carried the sharp tang of early spring, seeping through the cracked window above the sink. Daniel stood at the counter, his knife slicing through an apple with rhythmic precision, each cut a small act of devotion in a life that had known too much chaos. He was 36, his dark hair streaked with premature gray, his hazel eyes shadowed by sleepless nights and the weight of single parenthood. Into Ethan's lunchbox went 2 chicken sandwiches on whole-grain bread, carefully layered with lettuce and mayo, the apple's crisp halves, a chocolate chip cookie baked late last night when sleep wouldn't come, and a box of orange juice, its bright label a splash of color against the faded blue container. The lunchbox, battered and adorned with a peeling Spider-Man sticker, was more than a vessel, it was a promise, a tether to stability since Sarah's death 2 years ago. Sarah's car accident had shattered their world, a rainy night, a slick road, a call that still echoed in Daniel's nightmares. She'd been the light, the laughter, the glue. Without her, Daniel and Ethan were adrift, clinging to routines like life rafts. Ethan, 8 years old, with his tousled brown hair and eyes that mirrored his mother's warmth, was Daniel's lifeline, his reason to keep going. Packing his lunch was a ritual, a way to shield him from the world's unpredictability, to ensure he had something steady amid the storm of grief. But lately, that shield felt breached, its edges fraying under a mystery Daniel couldn't yet name. For weeks, Ethan had returned from school ravenous, his small hands trembling as he tore into whatever food he could find, crackers, bread, leftovers scavenged from the fridge. At first, Daniel dismissed it as a growth spurt. Boys his age were bottomless pits, weren't they? Sarah used to joke about it, saying Ethan would eat them out of house and home one day. But this was different, a hunger laced with something darker, something desperate that twisted Daniel's gut. Last night had been the breaking point. Ethan had burst through the door at 3:30 p.m., his navy backpack thudding to the floor like a stone, and raided the kitchen with a ferocity that stunned Daniel. He'd ripped into half a loaf of bread, smearing peanut butter with frantic urgency, his eyes, those hazel eyes that once sparkled with mischief, darting away whenever Daniel tried to catch them. It wasn't just appetite, it was survival, a quiet panic that clawed at Daniel's chest and refused to let go. "Ethan, buddy, you ready?" Daniel called, zipping the lunchbox shut with a soft click that echoed in the stillness. Ethan shuffled in, his sneakers scuffing the floor, his face pale beneath his messy hair, shadows pooling under his eyes. He nodded silently, grabbing the lunchbox with a hand that trembled faintly, and headed for the door, his small frame hunched under the backpack's weight. "Have a good day at school," Daniel shouted, stepping onto the porch, but the bus's growl swallowed his words, its diesel fumes mingling with the morning mist. Ethan vanished into the haze, leaving Daniel standing there, a hollow ache blooming in his gut, his breath fogging in the cold. That afternoon, Ethan stormed through the door again, the clock ticking toward 3:35 p.m. His backpack hit the floor with a dull thud that reverberated through the house, and he made a beeline for the fridge, yanking out a slice of leftover pizza from last weekend. He devoured it standing up, crumbs scattering across the counter like tiny accusations, his small hands moving with a speed that belied his usual calm demeanor. Daniel watched from the living room, his coffee cooling in his grip, the mug's warmth fading against his calloused palms. This wasn't a kid snacking after school, this was something primal, something wrong. "Hey, champ," Daniel said, rising and crossing the room, his voice light despite the tension coiling inside him like a spring wound too tight. "How was school today?" Ethan shrugged, his mouth full, his gaze fixed on the pizza, avoiding Daniel's eyes. "Fine," he mumbled, the word muffled by cheese and crust. Daniel set his mug down on the counter with a soft clink and crouched to Ethan's level, his knees creaking slightly from years of kneeling on hardware store floors. "You're eating like you skipped lunch. Everything okay at school?" Ethan froze mid-bite, his eyes flicking sideways, a shadow, fear, guilt, crossing his face like a cloud over the sun. "I ate," he mumbled, his voice barely audible, then turned back to the fridge, shutting down the conversation with a turn of his shoulder, his small body a wall Daniel couldn't breach. Daniel straightened, his chest tightening, his breath catching for a moment in his throat. Ethan had always been quiet, more so since Sarah's passing, retreating into himself like a turtle into its shell, his words rare and guarded. But this was different, that hesitation, that fleeting shadow in his son's expression, lodged in Daniel's mind like a splinter he couldn't pluck out, sharp and persistent. He didn't press further, not yet. Ethan was fragile, a boy still stitching himself back together after losing his mother, his world upended by a loss too big for his small shoulders. Pushing too hard might break him, might drive him deeper into silence. But Daniel couldn't shake the certainty that something was wrong, something he had to unravel, step by step, before it consumed them both. Daniel woke before his alarm the next morning, the gray pre-dawn light seeping through the curtains of his small bedroom, painting the walls in muted tones of shadow and doubt. He lay still, staring at the cracked ceiling, the faint hum of the house settling around him like a restless ghost. Ethan's behavior played on a loop in his mind, the hunger that bordered on frenzy, the evasiveness that cloaked his every answer, the way he'd flinched at the mention of lunch like a cornered animal. It wasn't a phase, not some childish quirk to outgrow with time. Something was happening at school, and Ethan wouldn't, or couldn't, tell him. The thought twisted in his gut, a mix of worry and frustration that propelled him out of bed, his bare feet cold against the hardwood floor. He splashed cold water on his face in the bathroom, the shock of it sharpening his resolve, the mirror reflecting a man tired but determined, lines etched deeper by sleepless nights. In the kitchen, he packed Ethan's lunch with surgical precision, his hands moving with deliberate care, sandwiches on the left, apple dead center, cookie and juice on the right, each item a checkpoint in his plan. He scratched a tiny dot on the sandwich wrappers with a black marker, a subtle trap to see if they'd been disturbed, a breadcrumb trail to follow. If Ethan wasn't eating, Daniel would know by evening, and that knowledge would light his path forward. Ethan trudged in, bleary-eyed, his backpack slung over one shoulder, the straps fraying at the edges from months of wear. He took the lunchbox without a word, his small fingers brushing Daniel's as he grabbed it, a fleeting touch that carried a weight Daniel couldn't name. He shuffled out to the bus, leaving Daniel staring after him through the fogged-up window, the glass cool against his fingertips as he pressed them there, watching Ethan's silhouette fade into the mist. At the hardware store, Daniel's mind wandered from his spreadsheets, the numbers blurring into nonsense on the flickering screen. He'd managed the place for 5 years, a steady gig in a strip mall just off Main Street, its shelves stocked with nails, screws, and tools that kept the world turning. It paid the bills, kept Ethan in sneakers and school supplies, gave them a roof over their heads, a modest ranch house with peeling paint, a sagging porch, and a backyard overgrown with weeds. But today, the clatter of tools and the chatter of customers, old Mr. Jenkins haggling over a wrench, Mrs. Lopez asking about paint swatches, couldn't hold his focus. Images of Ethan scavenging the kitchen haunted him, his small hands tearing into food, his refusal to meet Daniel's gaze, the way he'd shrunk into himself like a flower wilting under frost. By 2:30 p.m., he muttered to Pete, his assistant manager, a lanky kid with a perpetual grin, "I'm heading out early, family stuff," and drove home, the sedan's engine rattling as he pulled into the driveway just as the yellow school bus rumbled up, its brakes squealing. Ethan trudged through the door, his backpack dropping with a heavy thud that echoed in the quiet house, the sound bouncing off the walls like a warning. "Hey, buddy," Daniel said, forcing a smile that felt brittle on his lips, his voice straining to stay casual. "Good day?" "Fine," Ethan muttered, already rummaging through the pantry for a bag of crackers, his movements quick and mechanical, his small frame taut with something unspoken. Daniel waited until Ethan was distracted, munching absently on a handful of saltines, the crunch loud in the stillness, then grabbed the backpack and unzipped it with steady hands, his fingers brushing the rough canvas. He pulled out the lunchbox and flipped it open, empty. Completely empty. No crumbs, no apple core, no juice-stained straw. The sandwich wrappers were gone too, not even crumpled in the kitchen trash can, he checked moments later, his heart sinking as he peered into the bin. Daniel's stomach churned, a cold unease spreading through him like ink in water. Ethan wasn't a messy eater, never had been, even as a toddler, but this was too pristine, too perfect, like the food had vanished into a void, erased without a trace. "Ethan," he called, holding up the lunchbox, his voice steady despite the tremor in his chest, the weight of it heavy in his hand. "You ate all this today?" Ethan turned, his face paling, a cracker halfway to his mouth, his hazel eyes wide with something unspoken, fear, shame, a secret clawing to get out. "Yeah," he said, too fast, his voice a whisper that barely reached across the room, fragile as a thread. "You sure? Not a single crumb left?" Ethan nodded, his gaze dropping to the floor, his fingers tightening around the cracker until it crumbled into dust between them, scattering across the counter like ash. That night, Daniel sat at the kitchen table, the empty lunchbox staring back at him like an accusation carved in blue plastic, its silence louder than any words. He ran through scenarios in his mind, each one more troubling than the last, Ethan giving his food to a friend out of kindness, losing it in the chaos of recess amid the shouts and laughter, throwing it out to avoid eating for some inexplicable reason, a rebellion or a fear Daniel couldn't grasp. Or worse, someone taking it, snatching it from his hands. The thought made his jaw clench, his hands curling into fists on the tabletop, the wood cool and unyielding against his skin, grounding him against the storm in his head. If someone was taking Ethan's lunch, why wouldn't he say anything? Was he scared? Ashamed? Bullied into silence by a force Daniel couldn't yet see, a shadow lurking just out of reach? Daniel leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples, the ache spreading behind his eyes like a storm gathering strength, thunder rumbling in the distance of his thoughts. He couldn't confront Ethan yet, his son was a closed book, easily spooked since Sarah's death, retreating into silence when pressed too hard, his words locked away behind a wall of grief. Pushing now might make him retreat further into that shell, might bury the truth deeper where Daniel couldn't reach it. But doing nothing wasn't an option either, it ate at him, this helplessness, this not knowing, gnawing at his resolve like a rat at a rope. He needed evidence, something tangible to bridge the gap between Ethan's silence and the reality lurking beneath it, a lifeline to pull them both to safety. Tomorrow, he'd start digging, even if it meant stepping into the dark unknown, flashlight in hand, heart pounding. Sleep eluded Daniel that night, his mind a restless storm of worry and determination, the sheets tangled around his legs as he tossed and turned, the clock ticking past midnight with relentless indifference. By 5 a.m., he was up, brewing coffee strong enough to jolt him awake, its bitter scent filling the kitchen and grounding him in the moment, steam rising from the mug like a phantom. Ethan's hunger wasn't random, it was a pattern, a signal flashing red in the dark, and the school held the key, its brick walls hiding answers he needed to find. He'd go there, talk to someone, anyone, who might have seen something, anything to crack the mystery wide open, to peel back the layers of Ethan's silence. He packed Ethan's lunch as usual, the routine a lifeline amid his spiraling thoughts: sandwiches, apple, cookie, juice, each item a silent reassurance, a bulwark against the unknown. "See you later, champ," he said as Ethan grabbed the lunchbox and boarded the bus, his small figure swallowed by the morning mist that clung to the suburban streets, the air thick with damp and promise. Daniel climbed into his sedan, the engine coughing to life with a reluctant sputter, and drove to Westfield Elementary, a squat brick building nestled in a quiet corner of town just 10 minutes from home, its red roof faded by years of sun and rain. The parking lot buzzed with parents dropping off kids, the air alive with laughter, the squeak of sneakers on asphalt, and the occasional honk of a hurried car jockeying for space. Inside, the receptionist, Linda, greeted him with a warm smile, her gray hair pulled into a neat bun, her voice a cheerful lilt that grated against his tension. "Morning, Mr. Turner. Here for the principal?" Daniel nodded, his throat tight with anticipation, his hands shoved into his jacket pockets to hide their restless twitching. "It's urgent." "About Ethan?" She buzzed Mr. Carter, her fingers quick on the intercom, her voice cheerful as she confirmed he had a free slot in 10 minutes. Daniel paced the hall, his boots clicking against the tiled floor, the sound sharp and insistent, watching kids stream past, some chattering about weekend plans like a sleepover or a trip to the arcade, others lugging backpacks twice their size, their voices a cacophony of innocence that stung him with its contrast to Ethan's quiet. Ethan used to be that carefree, bounding home with tales of recess games and classroom antics, his laughter filling the house like music. Now he was a shadow, a ghost of that boy, and Daniel cursed himself for not noticing sooner, for letting it fester this long under his nose. Mr. Carter welcomed him into a cluttered office, his balding head gleaming under fluorescent lights, his tired smile not quite reaching his gray eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, the lenses smudged with fingerprints. "Daniel, good to see you." "What's going on?" he said, gesturing to a chair piled with folders, which Daniel ignored, standing instead, hands clasped tightly, his knuckles whitening against his jeans. "Ethan comes home starving every day, even though I pack him a full lunch, sandwiches, fruit, the works. He won't talk about it, and I'm worried something's wrong here at school, something he's hiding, something eating at him." Mr. Carter frowned, adjusting his glasses with a thoughtful hum, the sound sharp in the quiet room, his fingers lingering on the frame. "No reports of issues with Ethan. He's quiet, does his work, keeps to himself, flies under the radar. Any other changes you've noticed?" Daniel nodded, his voice steady despite the tremor in his chest, the words spilling out like water from a cracked dam. "He's withdrawn, nervous when I ask about lunch, flinches like I've caught him at something, like he's ashamed. Yesterday, his lunchbox was empty, too empty, like it was never touched. No crumbs, no wrappers, nothing, just gone." The principal leaned back in his chair, tapping a pen against his desk, the sound a staccato beat that matched Daniel's racing pulse, a metronome to his growing dread. Could be bullying, or something else entirely, hard to say without more. "Let's bring in his teacher, Ms. Evans, and a few classmates, see what they know, piece it together." Daniel agreed, relief flickering through him like a candle in the wind. Someone was listening, finally taking this seriously, giving him a foothold. Ms. Evans, a kind woman in her 50s with graying curls and a soft voice, joined them soon after, easing into a chair with a warm nod, her cardigan a soft green that clashed with the room's starkness. "Ethan's a sweet boy," she said, her hands folding in her lap, her fingers twisting a loose thread. But he's been quieter lately, more reserved, keeps his head down. I haven't noticed anything specific, though, not in my classroom, nothing overt. They called in 3 of Ethan's friends: Jake, a lanky boy with freckles dotting his nose like a constellation; Mia, a bright-eyed girl with braids swinging as she moved, her energy barely contained; and Liam, a shy kid with thick glasses that slid down his face, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. "Does Ethan eat lunch with you guys?" Daniel asked, leaning forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his voice tight with hope and fear. Jake shrugged, kicking at the floor with a scuffed sneaker, his voice casual. "He says he's not hungry," and walks off, usually toward the gym, away from us. Mia chimed in, twisting a braid around her finger, her brow furrowing. "I've never seen him with his lunchbox, not once, not even when we're all at the tables." Liam hesitated, pushing up his glasses with a trembling hand, his voice barely above a whisper. "I saw him throw something away once, near the trash cans by the gym, but I didn't check what it was, thought it was just trash, didn't think much of it." Daniel's heart sank, a cold weight settling in his chest, heavy and unyielding, pressing down until he could hardly breathe. If Ethan wasn't eating with his friends, where was his food going? Why the gym? Ms. Evans spoke up, her voice tentative, her hands tightening in her lap, the thread snapping under her fingers. "He does seem tense in Mr. Harris's gym class. The new teacher, he's strict, a little intimidating, runs a tight ship. Some kids don't like him, say he's too hard on them, too quick to snap." Daniel's eyes narrowed, his pulse quickening, a name clicking into place like a key in a lock. "What's he like?" he pressed, his voice low, urgent. "Firm," she said, choosing her words with care, her brow furrowing deeper. "A bit intense, likes things his way, doesn't bend. He's only been here a month, came from another district, still finding his footing, I suppose." Daniel left the office with that name, Mr. Harris, ringing in his ears like a bell tolling danger, a growing suspicion coiling tighter with every step down the hall, his boots echoing in the empty corridor. He needed more than hearsay, more than vague impressions from kids and a teacher's cautious hunch. He needed proof, something solid to hold on to, something to wield against whatever shadow loomed over his son, a weapon to cut through the fog. That evening, Daniel sat at his laptop in the dim glow of the living room, the house silent except for the faint creak of settling wood and the distant hum of traffic on Main Street. He scoured online forums for discreet recording devices, his fingers tapping restlessly on the keys, the screen's blue light casting harsh shadows across his tired face. He settled on a thumb-sized gadget with a 12-hour battery and crystal-clear audio, a sleek black thing that promised answers. He ordered it for same-day pickup from a local electronics store just off the highway, a 20-minute drive through quiet streets lined with budding trees. After work, he grabbed it, testing it in his car, whispering, "Test, test," then playing back the crisp, clear sound through the tinny speakers, the words sharp against the hum of the engine. It would do the job, he decided, pocketing it with a grim nod, his resolve hardening like steel in a forge. Before Ethan woke the next morning, Daniel packed the lunchbox with the usual care: sandwiches, apple, cookie, juice, his hands steady despite the nervous energy buzzing through him like a live wire. He slipped the device into the backpack's front pocket, tucking it beneath a pencil case where it wouldn't be noticed, its sleek black surface blending into the shadows of the worn canvas. "Have a good day, champ," he said as Ethan grabbed the lunchbox and left, his voice calm despite the adrenaline surging in his veins, his heart pounding a fierce rhythm. Ethan nodded, oblivious to the weight of the moment, and boarded the bus, his small frame disappearing into the morning bustle of kids and exhaust fumes, the mist swirling around him like a shroud. The day crawled by at the hardware store, each hour stretching into eternity, the clock's hands mocking him with their sluggish pace. Daniel fumbled with a shipment of screws, dropping half a dozen onto the concrete floor with a clatter that drew Pete's raised eyebrow, his mind fixed on Ethan. What if the device failed, battery dead, audio muffled by the chaos of a school day? What if he'd misjudged the situation entirely, chasing ghosts while Ethan suffered in silence? By 2:45 p.m., he clocked out, muttering an excuse to Pete about a family emergency, got a check on Ethan, something's up, and drove home, the sedan's tires humming against the asphalt, the steering wheel slick with sweat under his grip. He pulled into the driveway just as the bus rolled up, its brakes squealing like a warning cry. Ethan trudged through the door, dropping his backpack with a thud that reverberated through the quiet house, the sound bouncing off the walls like a drumbeat. He headed straight for the fridge, yanking open the door with a creak, pulling out leftover chicken nuggets from 2 nights ago. Daniel waited until he heard the clatter of a plate, Ethan piling the nuggets high, then grabbed the backpack, his hand steady as he retrieved the device from its hiding spot, his fingers brushing the rough canvas with a faint tremble. He shut himself in his office, a cramped room with peeling wallpaper and a desk littered with receipts, old coffee cups, and a framed photo of Sarah smiling on a beach, her hair whipping in the wind. He plugged the device into his laptop, the USB cord trembling slightly in his grip, and hit play, the audio crackling to life, kids laughing, lockers slamming, teachers barking orders over the din of the school day, a chaotic symphony he strained to sift through. He fast-forwarded to lunch, his breath held, his fingers hovering over the keys, the screen's glow casting harsh shadows across his face, deepening the lines of worry. Then, a voice cut through the noise, "Give it to me." Low, controlled, unmistakable, Mr. Harris, the gym teacher, his tone flat and commanding, a blade wrapped in velvet. Rustling followed, the sound of the lunchbox being opened, the zipper's faint rasp unmistakable, then Ethan's faint, trembling whisper, "Can I keep the apple?" A pause, heavy with tension, hung in the air, thick and suffocating, then Harris's reply, "Eat it fast and don't tell anyone," his voice chilling, devoid of warmth or hesitation, a command that brooked no defiance, wrapped in quiet menace. Daniel's fists clenched, his nails digging into his palms until they left crescent marks, his pulse hammering in his ears like a war drum, drowning out the hum of the laptop. His son's fear, captured in that timid plea, ignited a fury he hadn't felt since the night he'd gotten the call about Sarah, a white-hot rage that burned through his exhaustion, searing his veins. Harris wasn't just taking food, he was manipulating Ethan, turning it into a rule, a quiet tyranny that stripped his son of choice, of voice. How long had this gone on? Weeks, a month, since Harris arrived. Were other kids caught in this web, silenced by that same cold voice, their lunches vanishing into the same void? Daniel replayed the clip, each word a dagger twisting deeper into his resolve, the sound looping like a taunt. He had proof now, cold, hard evidence, a weapon in his hands, sharp and ready. It was time to move, to strike back, to reclaim what had been stolen from his son. Daniel sat in his office, the recording looping through his headphones, each replay stoking the fire in his chest until it roared, a furnace of anger and protectiveness. Harris's voice, calm, commanding, utterly devoid of remorse, echoed in his skull, a predator's purr that set his teeth on edge, but Ethan's whisper cut deeper, slicing through the haze of rage with surgical precision. "Can I keep the apple?" A plea, small and scared, a boy stripped of agency by a man who should have been his guardian, not his jailer. Daniel ripped off the headphones, pacing the cramped room, the faded carpet muffling his heavy steps, his shadow flickering against the peeling walls in the dim light of the desk lamp. He wanted to storm the school, drag Harris out by his smug collar and demand answers in the open air, his fists itching to connect with something solid. But he needed Ethan's trust first, needed to hear the full story from his son's lips, to understand the depth of the wound before he unleashed hell. At 7 p.m., he knocked on Ethan's door, the sound soft against the hum of the house, a gentle tap to coax his son out of the shell he'd built around himself. Ethan lay on his bed, a Spider-Man comic open across his chest, its pages creased from restless hands, his face tight with unease beneath the dim glow of his bedside lamp, the bulb casting a warm circle that didn't reach his eyes. "Hey, buddy," Daniel said, easing onto the edge of the mattress, the springs creaking under his weight, his voice a lifeline in the tense air, soft and steady like a heartbeat. "Can we talk?" Ethan nodded, closing the comic slowly, his fingers lingering on the pages as if anchoring himself against whatever came next, his small hands trembling faintly. "I know about the lunches," Daniel said gently, his words careful, measured, threading through the silence like a needle through fabric. "Someone's been taking them." Ethan tensed, gripping the comic until the edges crumpled, his knuckles widening against the colorful cover, his breath catching in his throat. "I know it's Mr. Harris," Daniel added, watching his son's reaction closely, his heart thudding as he spoke the name, the air thickening with the weight of it. Ethan's breath hitched, his eyes widening, a silent confirmation that hit Daniel like a punch to the gut, raw and undeniable, a truth laid bare. "How long's this been happening?" Daniel asked, keeping his tone soft, his hands resting lightly on his knees to hide their trembling, his fingers itching to reach out. "A while," Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible, lost in the rustle of his sheets as he shifted uncomfortably, his small body curling inward. "Since he started teaching us, since February, when he came." "Did he threaten you?" Daniel pressed, leaning closer, his shadow falling across Ethan's small form, his voice steady but urgent, needing every detail. "Not really," Ethan said, his gaze dropping to the comic, his fingers tracing Spider-Man's mask with a nervous twitch, the red lines blurring under his touch. "He just said it was a rule, like a class rule. Like I had to give it to him, every day. I didn't want to get in trouble, or make him mad. He'd get this look, like he was disappointed, and it scared me." Daniel's chest ached, a dull throb spreading through him like a bruise forming under his ribs, deep and tender. Manipulation, not violence, slyer, more insidious, a predator cloaking himself in authority, preying on a child's fear of consequence, on Ethan's need to please, to avoid conflict. "Why didn't you tell me, champ?" he asked, brushing Ethan's hair back, feeling the slight tremble beneath his touch, the warmth of his son's scalp grounding him against the rage simmering below. Ethan fidgeted, tearing at the comic's corner until a small piece fluttered free, landing on the blanket like a fallen leaf, his hands restless with guilt. "I thought I'd done something wrong," he murmured, his voice cracking, fragile as glass. "I didn't want you mad at me, or him mad at me. He said not to tell, said it was our secret, and I didn't know what to do. I thought maybe it was my fault." Daniel pulled him into a hug, feeling Ethan's small frame shudder against him, his thin arms wrapping tentatively around Daniel's back, his breath hitching with stifled sobs. "You did nothing wrong," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion, his throat tight, his eyes stinging with unshed tears. "This is on him, not you, not ever, Ethan. I'm fixing it, I swear. You're safe now, I promise you that." Ethan nodded, tears brimming in his hazel eyes, glistening under the lamplight like stars caught in a storm, and Daniel held him until his breathing steadied, the tension easing from his shoulders like a weight slipping away into the dark. Later, alone in the kitchen, Daniel's fury reignited, a slow burn that curled his hands into fists on the countertop, the wood cool and unyielding against his skin, a stark contrast to the heat in his blood. Harris had preyed on Ethan's vulnerability, his grief over Sarah, twisting it into compliance. Weeks of hunger, weeks of fear, all hidden behind a teacher's badge, a shield of authority turned into a weapon. How many days had Ethan sat in that gym class, stomach growling, too scared to speak, his small world shrinking under Harris's shadow? Were other kids suffering too, silenced by the same cold voice, the same false rule, their voices stolen as surely as their food? Tomorrow, Daniel would end it, for Ethan, and maybe for others he didn't yet know, others who needed a voice as much as his son did, a reckoning long overdue. Daniel barely slept, his resolve hardening with each restless hour, the recording device a weight in his pocket as he dressed at dawn, pulling on a faded jacket over his work shirt, the fabric rough against his skin. At 7:30 a.m., he drove to Westfield Elementary, the morning air sharp against his face as he stepped from his sedan, the engine ticking as it cooled in the parking lot. The school loomed ahead, its brick facade deceptively calm, a mask over whatever rot festered inside its halls, its windows glinting like unblinking eyes. He strode past chattering kids and harried parents dropping off their little ones, their voices a cheerful buzz he tuned out, his focus singular, his boots clicking against the asphalt with purpose. He entered the office, brushing off Linda's cheerful greeting, "Morning, Mr. Turner. Coffee?" With a curt nod, his jaw tight, his hands clenched in his pockets. "Daniel," Mr. Carter said, startled as Daniel burst through the door, his balding head catching the fluorescent light, his gray eyes widening behind his glasses, smudged with yesterday's fingerprints. "What's this about?" Daniel slammed the device on the desk, the thud echoing in the small room, a gunshot in the silence, his voice cold and unyielding. "Proof. Listen to it, now." Carter hesitated, his brow furrowing, his hand hovering over the device as if it might bite, then plugged in a pair of earbuds, his face shifting from curiosity to grim realization as Harris's voice filled his ears, "Give it to me, don't tell anyone." He yanked the earbuds out, his hands trembling slightly, setting them down with a clatter that rattled the pens on his desk. "Unacceptable," he muttered, his voice low, his gaze dropping to the desk as if ashamed to meet Daniel's eyes, his fingers tapping nervously. "Damn right it is," Daniel snapped, leaning forward, his palms flat on the desk, the wood creaking under his weight, his voice shaking with barely contained fury. "My son's been terrified under that man's control for weeks, hungry, scared, manipulated into silence. What are you going to do about it now, Carter?" "I'll suspend Harris immediately," Carter said, standing, his voice firm despite the unease flickering in his expression, his shoulders squaring as he reached for the phone. "An investigation will follow, we'll get to the bottom of this, I promise you." "I want to be there when you confront him," Daniel demanded, his tone leaving no room for negotiation, his eyes boring into Carter's with a ferocity that made the principal flinch. Carter nodded, reluctance shadowing his face, but he picked up the phone and summoned Harris with a clipped, "Get him in here now, emergency meeting." Minutes later, Harris entered, tall, broad-shouldered, his gym whistle dangling like a badge of authority, his dark hair slicked back, his posture oozing confidence, a man who owned every room he walked into. His smug smile faltered when he saw Daniel standing there, arms crossed, eyes blazing with a fury that could have melted steel, a storm ready to break. "Mr. Harris," Carter began, his voice clipped, rising from his chair, his hands gripping the desk's edge, "we have a recording, evidence of misconduct, serious misconduct." Harris took the earbuds, his composure cracking as his own words echoed back, "Give it to me, don't tell anyone," his jaw tightening, his eyes darting between Daniel and Carter, a trapped animal sizing up its cage. He set them down, his hands twitching at his sides, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool room. "It's out of context," he stammered, his voice thin, a weak shield against the truth, cracking under the weight of their stares. "Context?" Daniel roared, stepping forward, his fists clenching at his sides, his voice shaking with rage that spilled over like a dam bursting. "You stole from my son. Made him think it was a rule, normal, to go hungry every damn day. How many others have you done this to, you bastard? How many kids have you bullied into silence?" Harris opened his mouth, his lips parting as if to argue, then shut it, his eyes flickering with panic, cornered like a rat in a trap, his bravado crumbling. Carter intervened, his tone icy, cutting through the tension like a blade. "You're suspended, pending a full review. Leave now, security will escort you out. This ends today, Harris, no discussion." Harris walked out, head down, his whistle swinging uselessly, a staff member trailing him like a shadow, the door clicking shut behind them with finality. Daniel exhaled, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly, his breath ragged in the quiet room, his hands unclenching slowly. It wasn't over, not until the investigation ran its course, not until every stone was turned, but it was a start, a crack in Harris's armor, a step toward justice for Ethan, a battle won in a war still raging. The next morning, Daniel's phone buzzed at 7 a.m. with a text from Carter, the screen lighting up the dim kitchen as he sipped his coffee, the bitter taste grounding him. Harris resigned overnight, effective immediately. Investigation ongoing, already found discrepancies in his record. New oversight policies in place to prevent this again. Daniel read it twice, relief washing over him like a tide, loosening the knot in his chest that had tightened over weeks, his breath easing for the first time in days. Ethan wouldn't face Harris again, no more cold commands, no more stolen lunches, no more fear shadowing his days like a persistent storm. But healing his son was the real challenge, the wound deeper than a few weeks of hunger, a scar etched into his trust that time alone couldn't erase. At breakfast, Daniel handed Ethan his lunchbox, packed with extra care, sandwiches, apple, cookie, juice, and a bonus granola bar he'd slipped in, a small gesture of abundance, a promise of plenty. "No one's taking this, okay?" he said, meeting Ethan's eyes, searching for that flicker of belief, his voice warm but firm. Ethan nodded, a faint spark of trust returning to his gaze, his lips twitching into a half-smile that lit up his pale face, and boarded the bus with a tentative glance back, no fear shadowing his eyes this time, just a quiet hope that flickered like a candle in the wind. Daniel watched until the bus rounded the corner, its yellow bulk disappearing into the morning, then sank into a chair at the kitchen table, staring at the lunchbox he'd packed earlier, its twin sitting on the counter. It wasn't just food, it was security, a lifeline Harris had severed day after day, a betrayal of everything a school should stand for: safety, growth, trust. That night, Ethan ate dinner with gusto, spaghetti with meatballs, a rare treat Daniel had thrown together, the sauce simmering all afternoon with a tang of garlic and basil that filled the house with warmth. His appetite was unshadowed by fear, his fork twirling noodles with a spark of his old energy, his cheeks flushed with color, a boy emerging from a cocoon. Afterward, he curled up beside Daniel on the couch, a blanket draped over them, the TV flickering with a cartoon neither really watched, its colors dancing across the room in a soft glow, superheroes saving the day, a world where good triumphed. "Thanks, Dad," Ethan said quietly, his voice small but steady, his head resting against Daniel's arm, his warmth a balm. Daniel hugged him, resting his chin on Ethan's head, the familiar scent of his shampoo, something citrusy Sarah had picked years ago, grounding him in the moment. "Always, champ." Always, he murmured, his voice thick with relief, with love, his arm tightening protectively. The house settled around them, the night stretching out in a peaceful hush, the creak of the old walls a lullaby, the weight of weeks lifting inch by inch. Ethan wasn't whole yet. Trust took time, wounds took time, especially the kind that didn't bleed, but this was a beginning, a step toward light after too long in shadow, a foundation to build on. Daniel stared at the ceiling, the TV's hum fading into the background, and let himself hope, for Ethan, for them, for a future where fear didn't rule. Weeks later, spring unfurled outside Westfield Elementary, the air thick with the scent of blooming lilacs and fresh-cut grass, a promise of renewal that softened the edges of the world. Daniel watched from his car as Ethan laughed with Jake and Mia on the playground, kicking a soccer ball across the patchy field, his old spark blazing bright in his movements, his voice carrying on the breeze, high and clear, a sound Daniel hadn't heard in months. The investigation had uncovered more. Harris had targeted 2 other kids, a boy named Tommy from 3rd grade and a girl named Lila from 4th, using the same quiet coercion, the same false rule, to bend them to his will, their lunches vanishing into his control. Charges were filed: larceny, child endangerment, abuse of authority, and the school board rolled out stricter oversight, background checks tightened to catch red flags like Harris's spotty past, classroom monitors assigned to roam the halls, a zero-tolerance policy etched in stone and sent to every parent's inbox in a crisp PDF. Justice, at last, though it couldn't erase the scars, couldn't rewind the clock to before the shadow fell. At home, Ethan thrived, drawing superheroes at the kitchen table, his crayons scattering across the wood in a riot of color, reds and blues bleeding into each other, kicking a ball in the backyard until dusk painted the sky orange and purple, his laughter echoing off the fence, chattering about school over dinner, his words tumbling out without hesitation, a dam broken, a river freed. Daniel packed lunches daily, each one a silent vow renewed: sandwiches, fruit, a treat, a juice box, sometimes an extra cookie or a note tucked inside saying, "You're awesome, champ," a shield against the past, a brick in the wall of their rebuilt life. One evening, as they grilled burgers on the back porch, the smoke curling into the twilight, the sizzle of meat mingling with the chirp of crickets and the distant bark of a neighbor's dog, Ethan paused, a spatula in hand, his small frame silhouetted against the fading light, his hair catching the last rays of sun. "I'm okay now, Dad," he said, his hazel eyes clear, steady, a quiet strength shining through, a boy stepping out of shadow into something brighter. Daniel smiled, ruffling his hair, the weight of weeks lifting fully from his shoulders, a lightness he hadn't felt since before Sarah's death flooding through him like a warm tide. "Good. We're okay together," he said, his voice warm, solid, a promise kept, his hand resting on Ethan's shoulder, feeling the small, sturdy bones beneath his grip. The night stretched on, peaceful, the stars winking above through the branches of the old oak in their yard, its leaves rustling in a gentle breeze. They sat on the porch steps, burgers in hand, ketchup dripping onto paper plates, the world quiet except for the hum of life around them, crickets, a distant lawnmower, the soft thud of Ethan's ball against the grass as he kicked it idly. Daniel watched his son, saw the boy he'd been before, the one who'd raced around the yard with Sarah chasing him, who'd drawn pictures for her to tape on the fridge, emerging again, piece by piece. They'd survived, stronger, whole, a family rebuilt from the ashes of loss and betrayal, forged anew in the fire of this fight. The future stretched out before them, uncertain but bright, a canvas they'd paint together, one lunchbox, one laugh, one day at a time.